On April 26, 1986, at 1:23 a.m., one of the worst disasters ever to be recorded in history occurred when a nuclear reactor at the Chernobyl power plant malfunctioned and exploded. The events that transpired that morning, however, were not unpredictable nor unexpected, as the reactor's design suffered serious and lethal flaws. According to Mikhail Gorbachev, the nuclear meltdown at Chernobyl was perhaps the main cause of the Soviet Union's collapse. Indeed, the Chernobyl catastrophe was a historic turning point, 2006. The accident itself did not create the first fundamental crack in the Soviet structure, but rather the government's response did. The withholding of information about the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in Ukraine was the first fundamental crack in the Soviet system, marking the demise and eventual downfall of the Soviet Union. Chernobyl provided a pivotal turning point because the government directly violated its own glasnost policy. In the short term, the ensuing coup, wherein hardline communists overthrew Gorbachev, led to his resignation. In the long term, Chernobyl was an enticing incident that led to the dissolution of the USSR. In order to understand what happened on the night of April 26, 1986, data needs to be assessed from 25 years before, when the construction of the plant was commissioned. Towards the end of the 1960s, the Soviet Union needed a new power plant. Not only was the demand for energy increasing within the Union, but during the time, people were leaning towards using energy not derived from fossil fuels. The energy source needed to be capable of emitting 11.9 million kilowatts of energy, and with a 350 to 400 kilometer range of everything it was going to power. That much energy could only come from a nuclear power plant, and the only location that satisfied the requirements was a small village of Kapashi. And so, on December 11, 1969, the order of the Ministry of Energy and Electrification of the USSR ordered construction of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. All 4 units of the plant were completed in 1983, making the Chernobyl power plant the first nuclear power plant in Ukraine. A transcribed memo from Gorbachev demonstrates the government's knowledge of the accident. No reliable information about the accident was communicated to evacuees, and a word of the explosion was only spread through rumors.
At 1 p.m. on April 27, 1986, the town of Pripyat was ordered to evacuate in only 50 minutes. Citizens were told that the evacuation was temporary, but the Pripyat area remains uninhabited to this day, demonstrating the first mishandling of information distributed to the public by the Soviet government. Radiation released by the explosion at the Chernobyl power plant reached levels that by Soviet law must be reported to the public, but a 2-day information blackout ensued. TASS, the telegraph agency of the Soviet Union that provided all information to Soviet newspapers, radio, and other media, released no word of the accident until April 29th. It was only reported after Swedish authorities were alerted of high radiation levels by a radioactivity alarm at a local power plant that detected unusually high radiation levels on a worker's shoes. 2 days after the disaster, TASS relayed the information that there had been a disaster at Chernobyl, but the statement was short and severely minimized the effects of the accident. This retention of information marked a direct violation of Gorbachev's glasnost policy of communication between government and people and better dissemination of information. In addition, Gorbachev did not make his first official statement about the disaster until 19 days later, on May 14, 1986. The annual May Day celebration held by the Soviet Union only exaggerated the government's catastrophic failure of emergency management. May Day, a holiday observed in the Soviet Union to commemorate the accomplishments of workers, was celebrated by a large parade in Moscow, which continued in 1986 despite lethal levels of radiation in the air. This illustrated how the withholding of information caused danger to the people of the Soviet Union. Chernobyl had shattered the platform on which glasnost could succeed, exposing weaknesses in the Soviet system that led citizens to question the validity of their government. The betrayal of public trust caused a shift in the climate of the USSR and was the tipping point that made the Soviet system potentially unredeemable. The idea of openness preached by glasnost, combined with the government's failure in a moment of crisis, led to significant complaints and pushback against Mikhail Gorbachev. This was the last straw for many and caused a slew of anti-nuclear energy protests around the world.
Half an hour after the explosion took place, medical personnel arrived on the scene to an unsettling view. They took immediate action and brought over 130 people to the local hospital within the first 12 hours. None of them were wearing the correct clothing to clean up a nuclear explosion. According to local hospital records, 30 workers and firefighters as well as 28 people died from exposure immediately following the explosion. Almost 1,000 patients were admitted to the hospital on the first day, and of those, 237 of them were diagnosed with something called acute radiation syndrome. According to a Q&A with a radiation exposure expert from the University of California at San Francisco, 134 first responders were diagnosed with the disease. 28 of them died after 4 months and 19 more after 20 years. In total, over 20 years, 6,000 people were diagnosed with the disease, and of that, 95% would die without care and 50% would die with. Pregnant women during the explosion gave birth to children with diseases and defects due to radiation, such as Down syndrome and thyroid cancer. One final cause is that the water has never been drinkable since. Citizens of Pripyat were outraged by the distrust with the government that came after. Many of the people living near the plant had their main source of income from the land because the area was very rural around this. Due to this, the people had everlasting effects on their soil, had issues making money in the future. The government wanted to ensure safety among the citizens, so they evacuated the area, which later resulted in a downturn in their economy. The Chernobyl disaster highlighted multiple flaws in the government and the lies that they were hiding from their citizens. For example, the government assured soldiers that cleaning up the aftermath of the mess wouldn't hurt them. Gorbachev and the government spent over $70 million attempting to cover up the truth. A reporter who was the first to photograph the aftermath testified in the case that the government would go to any extent to cover it up. The impact of the Chernobyl tragedy caused a failure in the reform that was required to keep the Soviet Union afloat. The result was that the former countries of the USSR broke up and created independent unions. The downfall of the USSR also led to the end of the Cold War with the US, the arms race between America and the Soviet Union as they completed to amass nuclear weapons. The end of the Cold War eased tensions with America and the former USSR area of Eastern Europe.
Around the time of the dissolution of the USSR, KGB documents about the Chernobyl disaster began to be leaked to the public. The documents included details kept from the public, such as the previous incidents at the reactors, what actually happened during the night of April 26, 1986, the cover-up, and the truth behind the government's propaganda of the incident. The released documents contributed to Soviet people's resistance to the propaganda fed to them by their government. Throughout the years, these documents continued to be released to the public by the State Archives of the Security Service of Ukraine. Due to the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, anti-nuclear sentiments began to spread across Europe. In 1987, Italy passed legislation to completely phase out nuclear energy due to citizens' fear of a second disaster. The plan was fulfilled in 1990. Iceland, Poland, Greece, Cyprus, Norway, Denmark, Estonia, Latvia, Austria, and Croatia are all countries which have never touched nuclear energy since 1965, and their anti-nuclear sentiments persisted after the Chernobyl disaster until today. In Switzerland, Belgium, Czechia, Slovakia, Finland, and Germany, nuclear energy production plateaued until about 1995, when most effects of the disaster had passed. In the USSR, many protests of nuclear energy protected by glasnost resulted in the abandonment of the Chernobyl reactor model, the RMBK 1000. The anti-nuclear sentiments resulted in the closure of Chernobyl Reactor 1 in 1996 and Reactor 3 in 1999 after pressure from Western countries who condemned the lack of safety at the reactors. The anti-nuclear sentiments in the process of liquidation and decontamination at the time were reasons why in 2003 there was a Chernobyl forum held by the International Atomic Energy Agency. This forum discussed the long-term impacts of the disaster, the cleanup of the contamination, and the safety of nuclear energy. However, the convention underplayed the effects of the radioactive fallout, reinforcing a report from 2000, which states, apart from this thyroid cancer increase, there is no evidence of a major public health impact attributable to the radiation exposure 14 years after the accident. As a result of the minimization of the disaster, the public generally ignored the forum. The failed attempt to assure people that nuclear energy was safe resulted in the continuation of anti-nuclear sentiments. Another impact of the nuclear disaster and collapse of the Soviet Union is the Russia-Ukrainian War. The mishandling of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster caused the distrust between Ukraine and Russia, leading to the Russia-Ukrainian War after Vladimir Putin wanted to reclaim control of the former Soviet territory. The Russia-Ukrainian War started in 2014 after Russia annexed the Ukrainian territory Crimea.
In conclusion, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which in turn triggered the termination of the Cold War. In addition, it induced radiation illness and fear and distress to the people and the government. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster resulting in the dissolution of the Soviet Union highlights the fragility of the system built on lying to those who uphold it.